Thank you so much for that great welcome, everybody. And before I begin, a couple of things. I will answer questions at the end, and I also have a sign-up sheet at the back. So if any of you would like to receive the occasional newsletters that I send out, just, print very, very legibly. I was over in Goldsboro yesterday, and I just simply could not read some of the addresses that were given me. So they're going to say, you said sign up and get a letter. Where's my letter? Well, but thank you for coming, and thank you, Durham Library, for making me your 2012 read. I am so honored. I really do not have the words to tell you all just how honored I am by this. Ray Bradbury, who was the legendary speculative fiction writer who died this past June, often talked about finishing high school without the money to go on to college. Instead, he said, I went to the library, not college. Teachers inspire you, but libraries educate and fulfill you. I'm always happy to be part of events that celebrate libraries and the reading experience. To me, American libraries are a great expression of our country's aspiration to democracy for everyone. There was a time when books were only for the rich. Today, our public libraries make books accessible to everybody, rich, poor, every religion, every ethnic group. Excuse me. A couple of years ago, I was speaking down at the University of South Carolina, and at dinner that night, one of the professors told me about a friend of hers. When the girl was 12 or 13, she was out on the street several blocks from her house. She and some of the other black kids were sort of acting out and causing such a disturbance that someone called the police. She ran to keep from getting hauled in with the rest, and she darted into the nearest public building that she came to, and it was a library. It was the first time she had ever set foot in a library. And while she was waiting for things to settle down outside, she picked a book off the shelves and opened it and sat down in the middle of the aisle and was so hooked on the story that she had started reading that when she figured that it was safe for her to leave, she stuck the book under her shirt and walked out with it. When she finished reading it, she sneaked back into the library, replaced it, and stole another book. This went on for several weeks until one day as she was leaving, a kindly librarian smiled at her and said, honey, you don't need to keep stealing books. Let's issue you a library card, and you can take as many out and as often as you want. That little girl is now a PhD who teaches on the university level, something that never would have happened if she'd been kicked out of the library as an undesirable client. I was born in Greensboro, and my earliest library moment, I was probably about 4 years old, is of sitting in a circle on one of those little wee wooden oak chairs that they used to have at the Greensboro Public Library and listening entranced as the children's librarian read Dr. Seuss's Horton Hatches the Egg. Now, if any of you are parents, I'm sure you can quote it verbatim from memory. I certainly can. I had to read it enough times after I grew up and had a child. But this was my first hearing, and we sat wide-eyed and fearful that Maisie, that lazy bird, I don't know if you don't remember the story, it's basically a lazy bird talks an elephant into sitting on her egg while she goes flying off and, doesn't want to do it. But when she finally runs back and the egg is starting to crack, she wants to take the egg back. And we're going, oh my God, no. It's my egg, she sputtered. You stole it from me. Get off of my nest. Get out of my tree. Well, just picture the excitement when the egg burst apart, and out of the pieces of red and white shell from the egg that he'd sat on so long and so well, Horton the elephant saw something whiz. It had ears and a tail and a trunk, just like his. And it should be like that, because Horton was faithful. He sat and he sat. He meant what he said, and he said what he meant, and they sent him home happy 100%. When we could breathe again after all the tension. That librarian did something that still seems remarkable to me. She said, "Do you want to hear it again?" And of course we did, and this time it was even better the second time around, because we knew that faithfulness would triumph and we didn't have to be afraid. That's the magic of books. From the beginning, I loved language, I loved words, I loved the tricks that you can play with them. When I was 10 or 11, my aunt gave me a copy of Edna St. Vincent Millay's Renaissance, and I immediately decided that I wanted to be a poet. The first book I ever bought with my own money was a collection of her poems. I figured it out the other day how many hours I had to work in tobacco at 35 cents an hour to earn that book. And it works out to be about 16 hours of hard, dirty, nasty work. Any of you who've ever burned tobacco know exactly what I'm talking about. It's one of those things that I'm glad to have done. I am so glad I never have to do it again. But that book of poetry brought me many, many more hours of pleasure and enjoyment than it made working in tobacco worth it, if that's the kind of thing that you could do with some of your money. I was entranced by the formal patterns of the poetry, and I tried very hard to write poetry. I've tried to write sonnets and lines of metered rhyme that read like natural speech the way Edna Millay did, and yet still had the form under it. And when I reluctantly realized that I could not write real poetry, I learned very early that it's very easy to write rhyming lines. All you need is a rhyming dictionary if you can't do it yourself. Anybody can do it. You can do it. I can do it. Writing bad poetry is very easy. Writing good poetry is very hard, and I realized that I couldn't do it. So I turned to the next shortest form, which was the short story, and that's what I wrote for the next 8 or 12 years. And although I was selling pretty much, the market just sort of dried up under me, and I had to back into writing a novel. I never intended to write a novel. It terrified me. I was intimidated by it. I did not think that I could write at that length. And I kept doubling a short story until I finally doubled it into the novel length. You laugh. I started out, it was a short story, it didn't sell. I doubled it, it didn't sell. I doubled it into a magazine novelette, it didn't sell. I doubled it again into a sort of a book-length novelette and sent it off to a New York agent who said, like the story, like the characters, like the writing, it's too short. Could you double it? But all this time, even though I knew about other forms of writing, and I still loved the mystery most. That was what my short stories mostly were. Even though I sold mainstream, I really liked the mystery form. And I think that that's because of the poetry. There is a form in mystery writing. There's a set of rules. You have to have a crime. You have to have somebody solve that crime. And in the end, justice must appear to have been done. This doesn't mean that good is always rewarded. It doesn't mean that evil is always punished. But it does mean that in the end, you have to leave your reader with a sense of the inevitability of justice. Now, some people ask me if this is not limiting. And I say no, it's no more limiting than if you try to write a sonnet and it has to be 14 lines. If it's not 14 lines, it's not a sonnet. Indeed, one of Edna Millay's sonnets actually begins with, "I will put chaos into 14 lines." And that's a little bit how I feel that the mystery could be defined. You have to have that formal structure, but within that structure, You have the freedom to say anything you want. Robert Frost once said that he would just as soon play tennis without a net as to write poetry without a form. And he certainly was not limited in the scope of his work. I write what is called a traditional fair play mystery. This means the mystery, a puzzle, who done it, and why. Why did they do it? The murder is not a random drive-by. The killer and the victim know each other. I also, everything, because it is a fair play mystery, I do not let my sleuth, which in this case is a Judge, Deborah Knott, I do not let her see anything that I don't let all my readers see. Now she sees and comments on a lot of things that are red herrings, and you have to figure out which is a red herring and which is the right clue. But if you follow along and you separate out the ones that are not real, you can solve the mystery about 3 pages before she does. And then we can all feel smart, right? Now, I made my series sleuth for this series. The earlier series was a New York homicide detective. But in this one, it is a North Carolina District Court judge, Deborah Knott. She grew up on a working tobacco farm with 11 older brothers. In making her a district court judge, and I did it deliberately, I thought, what can I have that is not a New York homicide detective? Well, I'm not going to make her a homicide detective in North Carolina, but I did want to write out of my current experience of living in North Carolina, and something that would let me explore the state too. So I thought, well, I could make her a reporter, but that's been done. I could have her stay a lawyer. That's been done. I just couldn't think, and finally it hit on the idea of a district court judge. As a district court judge, she will never sit on a superior case. She will never do a murder case. She can stick her nose into things without having to recuse herself, because that's never going to show up in her courtroom. And I can send her all across the state to look at the various aspects. They don't do it as much as they used to, but when I first started writing these books, it was very common for judges to switch off with each other. For instance, when the blues were running at the coast, a mountain judge might say, hey, don't you want to come out and look at the leaves and let me go look at the coast and do a little fishing on the side? I've sent her across the state from Wilmington to Boone so that I could look at our state too and look at the issues that face our state. I've now written 18 novels about this woman, and I've visited the places that interested me. I've taken her from the furniture market in High Point, which I knew absolutely nothing about when I first started, to the mountains, which I've decided, that's when I learned for sure that I'm a flatlander and not a mountain person. Jeepers, sorry. I've taken her to Harkers Island and Wrightsville Beach, where I've attended a few judges' conferences. Excuse me a minute. No, I'm fine. It's just a little bug in my throat. Thank you. The judges' conferences have been very interesting. They made me an honorary judge. They won't give me a gavel. They won't give me a courtroom, but they said, so I don't know what the point is, but still. It's been a lot of fun to go and listen to them as they learn as to what are the new rulings from the Assembly and what from our legislature, and what the new rules are, the laws that they have to promulgate. It was interesting in that they even suggested that I should set a murder in the conference. And some of them even had suggestions as to who should be the judge. It was really funny when I was researching this book. Sand Sharks is the one, by the way, that's set down there at Wrightsville Beach. And I was researching it with a reporter from the local NPR station. And her mother and I are old friends. And so when she came to Wilmington, we reconnected, and we were down there. And I said, Megan, I really need to find a place to put the body. And she said, we'll find one. So I decided that the victim would come walking out of, now I'm going to get it messed up, I call it Jonas, but it's, what's the name of the restaurant there? Elijah's, yeah. So I called it the other. And the parking lot is right next to the walkway, the river walk. And the river walk is separated from the bank by, maybe 6 feet of really dirty, messy water, because everything washes up there. If you throw a Coke bottle in, if you throw a plastic water bottle in, a plastic bag, it'll all wash up there. If you look on the other side, that's where it's pretty and beautiful, clean-looking water. So she's pointing, we're standing there on the river walk with our backs to the pretty view and looking down in this almost like a sewer. And I said, you know, maybe that tree trunk over there, that broken off tree stub, that'll be a good place. If I push the body over, it can get caught by the shirt or something, and then it won't wash out to the sea. And we were agreeing, and I'm taking pictures. And all of a sudden, from behind us, comes this cultivated southern South Carolina accent. And the lady who's all dressed in her heels and her pearls and everything, who had just come from the hotel and heading for the restaurant. And she said, "Excuse me, could I ask what y'all are looking at?" And without missing a beat, Megan turned around. She said, "We're just looking for a place to hide the body." And the woman said, "Oh my goodness, isn't that interesting?" Over the years, I've touched on pollution, I've touched on race relations, overdevelopment, the phasing out of tobacco, the exploitation of migrant labor, but I've tried to do it without standing on a soapbox. I know that I'm writing popular fiction that's meant to be entertaining. If my readers want a sermon, they'll go to church. I understand this, I get it. And yet, if I can slide in a few of my own beliefs, my vision of what could be and should be with this state. Take industrial hemp, for instance. That would be a wonderful crop for our farmers as tobacco's being phased out. It would grow like a weed here. Well, it is a weed, right? But industrial hemp cannot be smoked for a marijuana high. But it could replace cotton as a fabric, and it can be processed into all sorts of paper products. It could replace fiberglass as an insulation in buildings. It just has so many uses. But it also has the name hemp attached to it. And our politicians act as if we're trying to corrupt our youth out of the even though you'd have to smoke a ton of the stuff to get high, and you'd have to smoke that ton in a short time frame, and you'd be dead from other stuff before you'd be dead. So I give a tiny infomercial about it in Up Jumps the Devil. In this book, Deborah's daddy, Judge Knott, is talking to her and her brothers about what might happen to the land. Will they stay farmers, or will they sell out to developers? If they stay farmers, will they continue to raise tobacco with all the negatives for pesticides and the chemical fertilizers, plus all the regulations of how often you should go back and prime the stalk, how many passes you make through the field, and what kind of humidity standards you do? Or will they try something different, like shiitake mushrooms or sunflowers or tuberoses? Or will they start raising ostriches instead of hogs? At one point, they're talking about ostriches, and one of the older women in the family says, "Ostriches? That's crazy. I'd be plumb ashamed to tell anybody we was raising ostriches instead of hogs." And one of the nieces says, "But Aunt Isabel, you know, ostriches are so much cleaner and they don't smell like hogs." And Aunt Isabel says, "Yeah, but hogs is more natural." So in this passage that I'm going to read, they've gathered on a cold November day to celebrate Thanksgiving together. And Judge Knott, who is Deborah's daddy, takes this opportunity to talk to his children about the future of the land that they own and what they're going to do with it. We got plenty of time, plenty of land. We're just talking out loud right now what we're going to do. Annie Sue opened the door and a blast of cold November air swept across the room. Aunt April says, tell y'all it's almost 2 o'clock, and everybody started coming in over at the home place. The mention of food, and a Thanksgiving feast at that, eased the tension that had built up in this room. Well, y'all think about it, Daddy said as we stirred to go. He looked down at his great-grandson asleep on his chest. What we were talking about would affect the rest of little Bert's life. Years from now, when he was an old, old man, would he and his cousins remember this day? And would they bless it or curse it? Daddy reached down and touched that smooth cheek with his work-worn finger. Y'all just think on it, he said. In writing these books, it's my hope that my readers will indeed think on it. Thank you. And I will answer questions, so if I said anything that made anybody want to know more, raise your hand. Yes? I'll repeat her question. How do I convince people to help me, and how do I do my research with ordinary walking around people? It's easy. If you approach with the idea of you really want to learn, people are more than happy to tell you. I have never met anybody yet, well, I take that back. A federal marshal didn't want to talk about the witness protection program. But other than that, if people love their work, and I don't care if they're ditch diggers or carpenters or what, if they love their work, they are more than happy to tell you about it. I once knew a bricklayer who built our house and built our chimneys, and he was in his 80s at the time, and he said, I'd have paid them to let me set bricks. I just love to lay bricks. And he was so interesting talking about how he did and how he did this and how he did that. When I went to Seagrove, that was an interesting time. When I went to Seagrove, one of the potters said, you got to get your hands dirty, and he made me, I was going to do a peanut bowl. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. He said, you got to get your hands dirty if you're going to write about making pottery. And he gave me a lump of clay, and he said, now the hardest thing is to center it. Well, I didn't find that hard at all. I just put my hands around it, and the wheel went around, and it centered. It was fine. He said, now you put your thumbs in, and to open it up. So I put my thumbs in, and all of a sudden up comes this phallic symbol. Just like that. He said, no, you've got to keep your thumbs together. So he took the wire and he pulled the wire across, and he took the lump of clay, put it in the bucket, gave me another lump of clay. So I centered it. And as I say, all I wanted to do was a little peanut bowl that I could tell people, look what I did when I was researching my book. So he gave me another lump of clay. I centered it. I put my thumbs in to open it up, and I kept them together this time. And the sides just came up magically. It really was magic to watch. It was not so magical to watch them collapse afterwards. So he pulled the wire across, bucket, another lump of clay. This time, he said, don't make it too high. So I did. I put my thumbs in, kept them together. The walls came up, and they only came up just about like that, and they were nice and thick. So I took my fingers out. He pulled the wire across. It didn't have a bottom. I'd gone all the way down to the wheel. Okay. Another lump. Thumbs together, up a little bit, but don't press down too hard or too long so that it would have a bottom. And he said, that looks pretty good. He pulled the wire across, and it looked pretty good. What nobody had told me up until that point, this is where you need to do your research, is that clay shrinks when it's fired. I now have the cutest little spoon rest you'd ever have. But you can, if you go and people are sure that you're not there to make fun of them, they will tell you everything. more than you want to know. I mean, you may get a spoon rest out of it. Another question? The book that's coming out in November is called The Buzzard Table, and it's set back in Colleton County. And in 3-Day Town, I let Deborah go to New York, and where, of course, a murder occurs. I am writing murder mysteries. A murder occurs, and who comes to solve it but my first series character, Lieutenant Sigrid Harrell of the New York Police Department. So I thought, turnabout's only fair play. So I bring her to North Carolina. So she'll be coming down to North Carolina. There's a real distant connection between Sigrid and Deborah. I mean, Deborah's mother and Sigrid's grandmother are related somehow. I'm not quite sure how, but I know there is a relation there. So anyhow, she comes down, and there is a murder that takes place. It turns out also that Sigrid has an English cousin that I hadn't been aware of until this book. And he's an ornithologist, and he is in North Carolina to do a book on southern vultures, comparing southern vultures to European vultures. Turns out that the turkey buzzard is a vulture. I didn't know that until I was writing this book. Did you all know that there is an American Vulture Society? Well, there is. You can learn more about vultures than you thought you wanted to know. But it's interesting because there was a recent NPR story just last week on how the vultures disappeared from India and cholera returned. Because what they were doing was putting some sort of antibiotics into the cattle feed. And so when the vultures fed on the cattle, it destroyed their kidneys and they were dying off. And as a result, cholera was reappearing. Because vultures have something in their gastric juices that can kill cholera germs. And so when you don't have the buzzards, the vultures, cleaning up the roadkill and the dying animals, this is what is going to happen. So anyhow, the American Vulture Society said I could use quotes from their website for my chapter captions, so I'm doing that. So you're going to learn a lot about vultures. And I don't know. I'll just leave it there. It's back in Colleton County. Yeah. Interesting that I would do something with the ballet or some of the arts was the question. Will I? I don't know. I hadn't really thought about that. I did, but that doesn't count. No, I was going to say I did get to go to the symphony and go backstage and talk to the symphony's librarian. I had never thought about the fact that they have to have a library. And for all of these different manuscripts and sheet music and everything for the different instruments. I've never given it any thought before. And to learn how pages are turned, because, I wrote a Sherlock Holmes short story for some collection or other. I forget who was editing it. But I noticed that the page turner, every time she would get up to turn the page, she would lick her thumb and then, turn the page. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was poison in that corner? So, yeah. So, but that's the closest I've come to doing something with the symphony or the ballet. But you may have given me an idea. Are you with the symphony or the ballet? When you put your email address on that sheet, please note down, just put ballet or something, and you and I may have to talk. No, this is how, see, this is how you get the person who has a question about research, this is how you get it. Somebody will say, oh, I know somebody who knows about that. And it's so much better if you can talk to somebody in person. And there's always, there's only 6 degrees of separation between you and the rest of the world, so you'll be sure to find somebody who knows something about what you want to know about. Yes?
I wonder if you could tell us about some of your favorite characters other than Deborah and Hetty.
You mean in the book? Oh, I'm very partial to Haywood. I just love Haywood, the brother. He is he's so full of himself, and he's so sure. I mean, you could tell him that you just won the Nobel Prize, and he would say, well, isn't that nice? Now, did you know I grew a watermelon that weighs 25 pounds? He just loves being a farmer. And one of the younger brothers has said he wanted to do anything else other than farm, and Haywood just absolutely could not understand that because he loved farming so much. So I adore Haywood. I mean, I'm always giving him too much to eat, and his wife keeps trying to, put him on a diet, and he won't. I also like one of the brothers, I think it's Andrew, his wife April, who never met a wall that she couldn't move in her house. I mean, she's always remodeling. She loved it when Hurricane Fran put a tree over the end of the house so that she could remodel the kitchen. Andrew's always saying he's afraid he's going to get up some night to go to the bathroom and come back and find the bedrooms on the other side of the house. So I have a lot of fun with them, I do. Another question? The question is, are all of my chapter headings totally relevant? She phrased it much more diplomatically than that, but that's what she means. Yes, they are to me. Somewhere or other there is a little nugget in there that pertains to what's happening in the chapter. Not always. I mean, it's sometimes hard to find, and I probably couldn't go back and tell you now what it was, but at the time it made sense to me. If they get in your way, just ignore them. They don't really. You had a question, yes. Okay, the question is, why, after writing so many books in the first person, am I now doing dual voices? Part of the narration is from Deborah, and it is first person. But more and more I'm going to, if I show things that there's no way that Deborah could know about them, if she's not actually on the front lines investigating, I could have Dwight or anybody, or the police or anybody tell her. But to me it's more immediate if I tell it from the close third person perspective. That way they don't have to tell her. I don't have to waste it's less clumsy and cumbersome to me to do it that way. And so far I think I've been able to keep it so that the reader is not confused as to whose eyes they're behind at the time. If it's a first person, I make sure I say I in the first paragraph if I can, and make sure that I start a new chapter before I switch viewpoints. Yeah. It just seems to work easier that way. I don't know. Maybe I should spend more time making Deborah. There's somebody who keeps writing me letters. If you're in the audience, I don't know, but there's somebody who keeps writing me letters who wants Deborah to get pregnant. Not going to happen, people. Not going to happen. No. They say, well, she'll have a robe on. You wouldn't know that she was pregnant. That wouldn't be a problem. Right. Like you can go chasing after a murderer when you've got an infant in your arms. And I don't care if you've got a snuggly or not. You can't go doing this with a baby. So if you're one of those who think Deborah ought to have a baby, forget about it. On the other hand, I did not intend for her to get married. And she went and did that without my planning on it. So I'm not really there for her birth control. I don't know what she's doing. Another question? One more? Yes.
Do you decide you want to showcase an aspect of North Carolina first, or do you come up with the concept of the murder and then decide, well, I'll put a little piece of North Carolina in there?
Normally I decide that I want to explore a setting, and I start with the setting, and then I look to see what conflicts are present in that setting. For instance, and Deborah always goes as a stranger. She does not go as a native. I mean, I think that would be too arrogant of me to pretend that she knows everything about where she's going. So while she's learning, I'm learning too. And often I will read the newspapers of that particular area, because that's how I find out what people are upset about or what they're caring about. Because I learned early on that if people are really ticked off about something, they will write letters to the editor, and that's where you learn what people are annoyed about or what they think ought to be addressed. And that's often, so I start with the setting, and then I see what's there, who the people are that will illustrate the setting but still have these conflicts that will lead to murder. Yeah. Okay, I think we're probably finished, right? I've talked way too much. Thank you so much.